I was tired of the squishy feeling and overtravel of my stock trigger in this HK416, so it's time for an upgrade. This rifle has a PolarStar F1 HPA engine in it. I chose to upgrade the trigger to an HPA speed trigger by Speed Airsoft. This trigger is specifically built for HPA engines, especially the PolarStar platform, and as a bonus, it's made right here in Canada. I'm going to skip the steps on the full breakdown of your rifle. If you want to know this typical process for an M4, you can check out my other tech videos. The process is very similar to get the gearbox out for an HPA or AEG. The speed trigger has an adjustment screw for trigger pull length and a second screw for overtravel adjustment. Both screws can be set and tuned once the trigger is installed and the gearbox is closed, so it's super easy to adjust later on if you need to. When you get the gearbox open, you want to take note of the trigger stop, and I'll show you why later. Make sure you can get the trigger in easily and adjust it unobstructed. I would start by just taking the trigger stop out. To do that, just undo the screw, remove the spring, and pop the trigger stop out. I removed my selector plate as well. That's because I needed to fix a semi and auto firing issue, which I'll go over by a separate video. When you pop off your selector plate, just be sure not to damage or hit the micro switch on the back of the trigger board. When you first install your trigger, do so carefully and without the spring and without the adjustment screws in. You want to check all around the trigger, the gearbox shell, and near the board to make sure there's no conflict or contact where it's not intended. The trigger should move freely. Check how the trigger travels forward and make sure it can make the full stroke unobstructed. Confirm visually if the trigger with no adjustment screw would bottom out on the micro switch. Careful not to over pull it in such a case until the adjustment screws are set and tuned. The reason the PolarStar trigger board may feel squishy is because the pull distance of the trigger is different for each gearbox brand, so they built a longer trigger microswitch specifically to allow some overtravel beyond the firing point, and that's to prevent microswitch from being damaged where stock triggers don't have any means for overtravel adjustment and maybe they bottom out. Carefully test fit the trigger with the spring installed but no adjustment screw. You just want to make sure the spring is operating as it should and rebounds the trigger. I wonder if PolarStar will ever include an adjustable trigger with a modified trigger board to get a complete kit with a more tactile feeling. What I do is use some blue thread locker on the adjustment screws to make sure they hold tight. Just apply some, set it overnight, and then install them the next day. Now test fit the trigger again without the spring, and this time you're going to set the adjustment screws visually with the gearbox open. When you set the pull length adjustment screw, what you're doing is pushing the trigger further forward from its default or rested state. You can go as far forward as you want, but you want to make sure it's not engaging the switch at all to start, or it's not firing right off the bat. This can be fine-tuned later with the gearbox closed. When you adjust the overtravel screw, what you're doing is making sure the trigger pull is physically stopped no further than required to engage the micro switch. A finely tuned trigger would have the trigger position such that you just have to touch it to pull, and then it ends exactly where the micro switch engages, and you want this distance to be as small as possible. Now you want to reinstall your trigger stop and check how it interacts with the trigger once it's adjusted. What I found was that the trigger stop couldn't even be activated because it would bind under the trigger. The trigger stop was just too long. I marked out the length to remove with a white paint pen, and if you need to, use some sandpaper or file to slim down the length of the trigger stop. Once the paint pen disappears, you should have a good length. Now retest the fit with the trigger stop in place. Now just assemble everything in the gearbox and double check that when the gearbox is closed, there's no binding or restriction on trigger movement. First do this without the receiver, and we'll check with the receiver later. You can make fine-tuned adjustments while test firing the gun. So for this step, we want to test fire and adjust, and the best way to do this is with no barrel or tank to start and just use the FCU and battery. The FCU board will tell you when it's detecting a firing, and the solenoid will make a sound to let you know. When adjusting, you want to tighten the screw to the point that the trigger will not contact the switch when pulled, then back the screw out while depressing the trigger until the system fires. If you really want to fine-tune, you can slowly engage the trigger and find the sweet spot point where it just engages and fires. Then you can trial and error your adjustment screws to match that point, and you'll know exactly when the HPA engine is engaged because of the FCU and solenoid noise. You want to make sure your trigger hits a hard stop before it bottoms out on the micro switch to avoid damage. You also want to make sure the overtravel adjustment screw is actually what's stopping the trigger and not the trigger directly on the gearbox shell. Otherwise, what's the point, right? For a final check before full assembly, you want to drop your gearbox into your lower receiver. You just want to make sure that the trigger isn't going to contact or bind on anything in the lower receiver. Some gearboxes and some lower receivers may require modification for everything to fit just right. I've installed these triggers in optical board MOSFETs like the Titan, and you can tune these down to the millimeter of movement. The microswitch for the PolarStar is quite long, and it's a physical switch, so I don't think the adjustments can be that fine-tuned, but you'll definitely find an improvement in your trigger feeling and experience.